Hello, welcome to Dateline London. And this week, a second wave in August might threaten more than summer holidays. Trump watchers weigh a bid to postpone November's presidential election. And the name's Moore, Richard Moore. What does it take to lead a Secret Service in 2020? My guests on socially distanced screens, political analyst Eunice Goesch and Henry Chu of the Los Angeles Times. And here in the studio, BBC Newsnight's diplomatic editor, Mark Urban. Welcome to you all. Virus spikes, flight cancellations and a new recession low for the Eurozone. It is more grim news for a continent whose leisure and tourism industries had hoped to salvage a small something from August's holiday high season after a ruinous first half to the year. Eunice, that I think takes us to you. What is your assessment of the worries in many European countries that we're bound for a second wave?
Well, you're talking about a second wave, when in reality, perhaps we are witnessing the continuation of the first wave, and so essentially not really of a second wave. In Southern Europe, governments are extremely worried. I think Spain and France are very concerned with the recent rise in cases, and it's been quite a dramatic rise in cases. At the same time, where they are trying to manage their tourism industry, which plays a very big role in their economies. In the case of Spain, it's over 10% of Spanish GDP, which is now suffering tremendously because Britain, France, many other European countries are imposing bans, so not establishing air bridges with Spain. And that means a lot of economic worry. So it's very, very worrying. And I think for European governments, it is very challenging because they have to manage, on one hand, COVID-19, and the threat to public health, and it's a massive threat to public health, but also the impact on the economy. And we've seen already that so far COVID-19 has had a catastrophic impact in all the world economies. The Eurozone in particular, the Eurozone will, and the European Union will suffer a much bigger contraction than it was initially forecasted. And we have to manage those risks because, yes, we can be protecting public health from COVID-19, but the public health systems will not be able to respond to the challenges if countries are suffering really serious economic depressions.
And Henry, just turning to this, going back to this question of summer vacations spreading virus, it looks like that is a problem in the US as well.
Well, there definitely has been another surge in coronavirus infections in the U.S., and we've seen the death toll rising as well. It's been fueled by a lot of the southern states in what we call the Sun Belt. So you're talking about California, Texas, Arizona, Florida. But I actually wouldn't say that it's from summer vacations, at least just yet, because the data do lag behind slightly. Really, in many of these states, it was because of aggressive reopenings by Republican governors who were allying themselves with President Trump's call to liberate their states. And now they're bearing the fruit of that, unfortunately, with greater rises of coronavirus caseloads in many of these states. And they're having to roll back some of the lockdown easing that they had already instituted about maybe a couple of months ago. So we're seeing that they're reaping the whirlwind, unfortunately, in many ways, particularly Florida, where on Thursday, I think, you had a death toll of about 10 people every hour. Now, there is some good news at the moment, which is that the nationwide caseload seems to be leveling off. There's about 60,000 caseload per day, new caseload per day, which actually in the U.S. is not bad, given the population of over 350 million people. What that means, though, is that it's masking where the coronavirus caseload is still rising in some states. It's now hopscotched from those southern Sunbelt states to the Midwest. So we have the wave of infections that really hit the East Coast hard, particularly New York. And that was what we saw first. Then it started spreading and surging amongst the southern states. And now we see that it's now moved over to the Midwest. So there's no room for any complacency. And in fact, many states are again thinking about reinstituting lockdowns, and even southern states such as Alabama have issued mask-wearing orders, which they thought they would be able to avoid up till now.
And Mark, coming to the UK, we learned this past week that what many had been saying for a while, that England had the highest number of excess deaths between February and June in Europe. Now, obviously, Boris Johnson is taking a firm and fast approach at the moment in terms of slowing down the easing of lockdown, but is he carrying the country with him?
Well, I think one of the things we've learnt in the past 24 hours with these changes that Boris Johnson made is that there does not seem to be any political penalty to caution in this. I think he's observed what happened in the early phases of this, where clearly a lot of people believe he was too slow to lock the country down. And he's also seen how the leaders of our devolved governments in the UK, in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, by taking a more cautious approach, have reaped political benefit. And the fascinating thing yesterday was that when he announced he was pumping on the brake pedal, as he put it, to slow down the easing of certain restrictions, and of course parts of northwest England are now under tighter social distancing rules again. It was interesting that essentially the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, almost immediately came out and said, we support this. And the thing just didn't catch fire in the sense of any kind of real political debate. So I think he's discovered through a hard-won experience that taking a cautious line has both public and political support.
And I'm interested, just before we move back to Europe on this, about the demographic in terms of the young, because there's a lot of focus now on young people. In Spain, the hashtag don't chuck it all away. This suggestion that it is young people who are increasingly spreading with their summer parties and so on, the virus. Do you think we can tell whether that's just a temporary problem that will go away or a permanent COVID fatigue?
Well, you know, I think your perspective on this in some degree depends on which generation you're from. I mean, some epidemiologists have been saying, well, naturally, when the restrictions started to be eased, the younger working population, say people in their 20s, maybe even late teens as well, were bound to be the ones who introduced themselves back into society most rapidly. A lot of older people in the shielding category, they weren't going to do that. But I think there is also a fairly fierce intergenerational thing building up here. I mean, I was talking through with my son some of the restrictions and our concerns about the fact that, we suspect he's not keeping to all the restrictions, and he just let rip with, this is all part of the older generation oppressing us, he said to me. And I think that is quite a big factor, I think, in many societies now, that young people, almost as an assertion of their own rights and of their own joie de vivre, or whatever you would want to call it, their desire to be in life, to be with friends and to associate, want to challenge this almost as an assertion of generational identity.
Eunice, do you see that in Europe?
Well, I do see that in Europe, and I totally sympathize with Mark. My teenage daughter has also suffered tremendously from the lack of socialization because of lockdown. And it's, we have to, we need to sympathize and understand that the kind of lives that young people are experiencing at the moment are a far cry from, the liberty, the joie de vivre that young people are expected to live in their 17s, 18s, early 20s. In Europe, we're seeing very much, I think, the rise in spike in France, in Spain, to a certain extent in Portugal, is associated with movements of young people. The opening of nightclubs, the socialization, in beaches, parties, and so on, will mean that there's a much higher transmission rate. And the big worry is this will continue once schools will open and some universities will open. So it is quite a big concern.
And Eunice, do you have a sense of where this fits into the global picture? Because some of this joie de vivre language applies presumably to young people in the developed world. In the developing world, the picture is extremely critical for young people economically, as well as their parents and grandparents in terms of their life chances. So just in terms of the global picture, we've also heard in the last few hours that Mexico is, moving into third place in terms of overall deaths from the virus. Just give us the global picture in a nutshell.
Well, the global picture is extremely grim. We are on the way. We are already in the middle of the greatest economic shock of the last 100 years. Europe is facing a terrible economic crisis, and unemployment is, I think, at the moment almost doubling what it was in January. And the situation will get worse once the government, the state programs to support employment will close at some stage later in this year. So the economic consequences are going to be very dire, and are going to be extremely dire for the younger generations, who are, especially those who are graduating from university at the moment or leaving school at the moment, because there's no jobs. And what we've known from other periods of economic recessions, if you are out of the economic ladder, in an employment ladder at one particular stage in your life, it is very difficult to get back in. So this is a generation that is really in danger of being scarred for a very long time, for pretty much all of their working career. So I think the young are feeling, what are our chances? What kind of life, to what kind of world are we going to wake up once all of this is over? Europe is trying to respond to that. European Union a couple of weeks ago agreed a big rescue plan to help the most struggling economies, those who have been most adversely affected by COVID-19, but also those whose economies are suffering now by the lockdowns, those who rely a lot on the tourism and travel industries. But will this be enough? We do not know. I think we've been talking a lot about a kind of a transformational change to our economies. We've been seeing the state changing its role in the economy in a way that it hasn't been seen in over 40 years. But will the changes that have been introduced be long-lasting? Will they result into sustainable, greener and more productive economies? We do not know.
Well, those questions will sustain Dateline London for many months to come, or for indeed years to come. Henry, just give us your final thought on this topic. I want you to lead on the next topic, so make it fairly brief.
I think this is the challenge for the government in terms of tailoring its messaging. I think the coronavirus has hit different groups of people in different ways, and so they need to be targeted with messages that resonate with them. And so for young people, for young men, and men in particular who are reluctant to wear masks, they need to have and hear particular messages that are directed at them.
Thank you for that very apposite point. Now, let's move on. Ever since 1845, American presidential elections have taken place on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Now, that puts the 2020 vote on the 3rd of November. President Trump suggests a delay due to the risk of fraud via postal ballot. But key Republicans have already dismissed that idea, and a combination of virus, recession and civil unrest are making it hard for President Trump to write the news headlines. Henry, were you surprised by how fast key Republicans squashed this idea?
I'm always surprised now when any Republicans actually go against what Trump says, because many of them are afraid of alienating his very fervent base of voters out there. And many of them are themselves up for re-election in November. But I think actually that's part of the clue as to why some of them came out so quickly against it. Because they're up for re-election and have amassed war chests that they're now going through in terms of trying to campaign, they themselves are reluctant to have any further delay to the polls being opened. And also, in a sense, by calling into question the American election date, which is set constitutionally, as you mentioned, that also calls into question the greatness and capability of America to have a functioning democracy. And so it didn't surprise me as much as perhaps it might have in other issues for Republicans to pile on. But I think we need to be clear-eyed about just what was motivating Trump in terms of coming out with this tweet. I think he knows full well that he is himself, as president, unable to effect such a change to the election date. That power rests solely with Congress, which right now in the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, is controlled by Democrats. And so it's a complete non-starter when it comes to an actual process of trying to change the date. However, he is also a master of political theater. And as we know now, his tweet came out just a few minutes before the news emerged that the American economy in the second quarter had contracted by 1/3, which is the greatest contraction in the history of the measurement of the American economy. And also, as you mentioned in the lead up, his message was mostly about trying to cast doubt on the validity of the mail-in votes that we'll be seeing in much greater numbers in November. And so this, I think, was part of just his plan to try to delegitimize the outcome if it should go against him. And as all the polls right now are showing that it will. It's still early days, but yes.
Mark, 20 years ago, I mean, those of us old enough to remember the hanging chads in Florida and the Supreme Court having to decide the outcome of that presidential election. You know, judging from what Henry's just said, do you think there's a possibility that we're heading to a Supreme Court decision again if an attempt to delegitimise the vote is in prospect?
Well, everything I read from constitutional experts in Washington, D.C., and what Henry said underlines that really, is it's quite hard for President Trump even to get the country seriously into the area of doubt on this, because the Constitution is so clear about his lack of power to set the election. I think if it's a very close election, of course, there are various scenarios in which he may attempt to cast doubt on the result. I see he's been suggesting that all the votes be counted and tallied on a single day. Various ideas are now flying about. It could come to a legal intervention, but let's face it, at the moment, the polls would suggest it's a fairly hefty defeat he's heading towards. And then that leads you into all these interpretations about why is he doing what he's doing. Is it purely the interests of the moment, as Henry said, because of the terrible figures about the economy? Is he, as some people saying, just trying to put a brave face on the fact he's probably going to lose and come up with an explanation before the fact? Or is it something darker? Is he trying to provoke people, conspiracists or others on the right, into disorder, which might provide a more, if you like, intense disruption of voting?
And Eunice, can we talk for a moment about the front runner then? Joe Biden's still fairly quiet, but his choice of running mate is going to make a splash. What factors will he be weighing up?
Well, the advisors of Joe Biden are very concerned with having somebody who will be a kind of a loyal vice president. There is over 10 potential candidates, but I think there are three main candidates. There's Kamala Harris, Susan Rice, and Elizabeth Warren. I think they are the three leading contenders. And the debate is about, what do they bring to the table? What are the important things for Joe Biden? Is it experience in foreign policy, so the ability to come up with actions on Russia and China, ability to also help manage the pandemic? Is it loyalty? Is it widening the electoral base of Joe Biden, because he's doing very well with floating voters, with the typical centrist Democratic voter, but perhaps less well with younger and female voters, also African-American voters. So I think he's going to ponder around these kinds of issues. And I think he's also very worried with having somebody with whom he gets along well fine. He had a very good working experience with President Obama when he was his vice president. And I think he would like to see replicated the same type of experience. One interesting thing is there's been in the last days quite a big campaign amongst his donors against Kamala Harris on the grounds that she's not sufficiently loyal, which is a bit of a strange accusation made to a politician when they were, all of them competing to be the Democratic candidate to be the president, to be president, to run for the presidency. So we'll see. I think we're going to know in the next few days. But I think he's going to value above all experience in foreign policy and the ability to widen his electoral base, and of course somebody with whom he gets along well.
And Henry, presumably President Trump watching closely, because it's one thing to say, Sleepy Joe and painting Joe Biden as a kind of do-nothing grandpa, but it's hard to at the same time present him as an extremist. But it depends, because if the choice of running mate is a progressive, then that becomes easier, I guess.
That's right. I mean, right now, everybody's hanging on this choice, which I think will probably be a woman of color because of the moment that we're living through, certainly in the U.S. with the Black Lives Matter movement, but also Biden's own commitment to civil rights and to the advancement of Black Americans. But it's still 3 months to go, and anything can happen between now and then. Biden has been relatively silent, broadcasting from his basement in Delaware because of the coronavirus crisis. We can't forget that he has also been prone to gaffes in the past. And in fact, with an African-American man whom he accused of being not black enough if he didn't support him. So anything can happen out of Biden's mouth that we need to be prepared for. Trump also could pull off what we call an October surprise, even a military intervention somewhere. I mean, the conflict with China, the confrontation with China is certainly ramping up. So I wouldn't discount anything happening between now and November. And the wild card really is the coronavirus. I mean, if a vaccine were to be found effective between now and then, that could also just throw the race into a completely new territory with President Trump claiming victory on that.
We hear you. We will be watching closely. Let's move on to our third topic. Britain's spies have a new C, that is, a new chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. The role, made famous in the James Bond books and movies, goes to Richard Moore, Libyan-born, Turkish-speaking, interests including porcelain and cricket. Now, we don't know whether Mr. Moore prefers his martinis shaken or stirred, but we do know we live in dangerous times. Mark, what does it take to run an intelligence service at this moment in history?
Well, I think they've got, in a sense, the perfect candidate given the workings of the Whitehall machine at this particular moment. So he had a career as an MI6 officer running agents, effectively.
Is that normal for somebody to be kind of an intelligence officer who then becomes an ambassador? I hadn't realised it was so porous.
No, it's unusual, actually. But I have to say, when you talk to people in the service, they now say that a period outside, and most recently as political director of the Foreign Office, is very much a desired characteristic for someone who's got to run that service. They want people to be known around Whitehall, and in that position he clearly was, in Downing Street and all the other key customers, as they see it, for secret intelligence. They want somebody who flits easily, who is not, if you like, too ingrained in the culture of secrecy and tradecraft, and would step blinking onto the stage of being chief of the service, perhaps ill-equipped to take on all the demands. I mean, in terms of his experience and his portfolio, there's no doubt, when we look at what's happened in the last couple of months in the UK, that reshaping intelligence around the Chinese target is going to be critical. Russia, of course, we heard last week about the Russia report and the sense that perhaps the intelligence services had been complacent. That was the accusation from the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. And lastly, I think he's bound to bring a focus on the Mediterranean region. He is steeped in Turkey as a culture. He speaks Turkish extremely well. He tweets in Turkish as well as English, and he was ambassador there. He will be looking to see how far President Erdogan's recent assertiveness might threaten the peace of the region.
Let's, Henry, I want to take up the China point with you. I mean, making China target is all very well, but it's very, very difficult to get any information out of Xi Jinping's China, or is it easier for some people?
Well, certainly China has its own allies. I mean, if it were Pakistan or North Korea we're talking about, with which China has a very close relationship, there's intelligence sharing going on all the time between those three. There was a period directly after the 9/11 attacks when the U.S. and China seemed to be on a better footing when it came to intelligence sharing. The overall relationship was better. And that's what we have to remember, is that intelligence cooperation is always going to be dictated by the overall state of diplomatic relations between states. And right now, as we see the U.S. Becoming increasingly confrontational with China and vice versa, also Britain is becoming more and more assertive against China. The idea that they would be actually sharing intelligence, I think, is beginning to recede further and further. Now, every state will share the intelligence that it feels suits them, that it will further their aims. And so China is no different on that score. If it comes to matters of, for example, Islamic terrorism, which they try to pin on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who are Turkic-speaking people, so here the new MI6 director actually would probably have more of an in. That might actually be an area where they would find common ground. But increasingly, I think, between the West and China, it's becoming a more and more fraught relationship.
And Eunice, give us a European take on this, because obviously it's one thing to attempt to gather intelligence in societies like China or Russia, but obviously for Chinese or Russian agents inside open societies, whether the UK, Europe, North America, these are much more porous and open places to gather information, surely.
Well, Europe has hardened its stances on China, against China and Russia. Just this week, the EU has issued sanctions against Russia, China, and North Korea on cybercrime charges and other activities. And we've also seen, the hardening of stances towards China since at least last year. The European Commission, in its strategic review, defined China as a strategic rival. And so there is a recognition that China is a very important economic partner for Europe, but there is a greater awareness of the security challenges that it poses. And many European countries, France in particular, is getting increasingly impatient and angry with Chinese interference and Chinese activities in terms of cybercrime, data collection, and so on. So we've seen a change of attitude. Now, the way that Europe will deal with China will not be the confrontational manner of the United States, because of all the economic stakes that are involved. But it will. We've seen that hardening of positions.
And Eunice, we're going to have to leave it there. And Henry and Mark, thank you all so much. It's been another fascinating half hour. And thanks to you for watching. That's it for Dateline London for this week. Back next week, same place, same time. Goodbye.
Well, back tomorrow with some Andrew and Ma, I think. Yeah, Sunday. Fuck me, it's August already. Jesus Christ, it's flew over. See you tomorrow. Bye.